Can you believe it? Japan, a nation long considered America's #1 obedient ally, is now staging a dramatic rebellion. Let's delve into how Japan is challenging the US. First, in terms of attitude, the recent US-Japan tariff negotiations have been truly captivating. Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba explicitly stated that he's in no rush to reach an agreement, deliberately pushing back the original June deadline to July. What's more, he's adamant that the US must lift all tariffs, including the 25% on automobiles, 25% on steel and aluminum, the 24% retaliatory tariffs, and even flat out refuses to pay the 10% global foundational tariff. Even more astonishing, when the US attempted to link tariff discussions with economic security, promoting their strategic agenda, Japan flatly refused to engage. Meanwhile, at the 30th International Forum for Asia's Future, held in Tokyo on May 29th, Ishiba boldly criticized US tariff policies, stating that high tariffs fundamentally cannot bring economic prosperity. He argued that prosperity built on sacrificing the interests of others or other countries is inherently unstable. This was a direct slap in the face. Keep in mind, Japan has historically always followed America's lead on the international stage. This sudden shift in direction is truly unexpected. But Japan isn't just all talk, their actions have been even bolder. Beyond their tough stance in tariff negotiations, Japan's subtle maneuvers in the capital markets have been jaw-dropping. As everyone knows, since Abenomics was introduced, Japan has pursued quantitative easing for over a decade. This allowed a large number of American capitalists and Japanese Mrs. Watanabe investors to borrow money from Japan at ultra-low interest rates. They would then invest this money in American financial markets, profiting from both exchange rate differences and asset appreciation, a truly lucrative arrangement. However, starting in March of last year, the Bank of Japan's approach abruptly changed. They ended their negative interest rate policy, abolished yield curve control, and began gradually implementing quantitative tightening. Of course, Japan is doing this for its own self-interest, but the crucial point is that Japan has always been America's junior partner. Previously, its own interests were always subservient to American interests. For example, in April of last year, Japan initially wanted to raise interest rates, but the US disagreed. Then, after intervention from the Tokyo District Public Prosecutor's Office, which those familiar with Japanese politics know is a US-controlled Eastern Depot intelligence agency embedded in the Japanese political arena, Japan immediately paused its rate hike plans. Normally, this time should be no different. Whatever America says, Japan should obey. But everyone knows that US Treasury yields have been soaring. In the coming months, over $2 trillion in old debt will mature each month, requiring new bond issuance to replace it. If new bonds are issued at the current high yields, the US Treasury's coffers for the next few years would likely be consumed by interest payments. Can Trump tolerate that? Under normal circumstances, how should the Japanese government respond? They should certainly share the burden with their American daddy. The Bank of Japan should step in and continue purchasing Japanese bonds to suppress Japanese bond yields. This would encourage continued capital outflow from Japan into US Treasury bonds, thereby lowering US Treasury yields. But this time, the Bank of Japan did the opposite. Not only did they not buy Japanese bonds, but they continued their tightening policies, constantly pushing up Japanese bond yields. As Japanese bond yields rise, the cost of using Japanese yen capital increases. The money that had previously flowed from Japan to the US would undoubtedly be quickly divested from American assets and repatriated to Japan. This is like rubbing salt in the wounds of the US bond market. This is hardly the behavior of an obedient ally. Of course, Japan has its own explanation. They claim that domestic inflation is too severe, with rice now costing 1,000 yuan per kilogram, equivalent to over 20 INR per jin. The public is complaining bitterly, leaving them with no choice. At first glance, this seems plausible. But upon closer examination, problems arise. If there's a rice shortage, they can import it, not to mention nearby China and Southeast Asia, where cheap rice is readily available and not subject to export bans. Why not simply buy from them? Surely Japan isn't so poor it can't afford rice. Even American agricultural products have been eager to find overseas markets. If Japan opened its doors, the US would surely be delighted to feed them. But Japan further explains that they need to protect the interests of their domestic farmers, which is why they've always restricted rice imports. Furthermore, the agricultural cooperatives in Japan wield significant power, and disrupting their interests would impact politicians' approval ratings. This explanation sounds somewhat ambiguous. While it's true that Japanese agricultural cooperatives are powerful and have historically restricted rice imports, the situation is now dire. On one hand, there's a domestic rice shortage and people are hungry. On the other hand, their American daddy urgently needs Japan's financial assistance. Can the agricultural cooperatives' power truly outweigh the stomachs of the Japanese people and the financial needs of their American daddy? Upon this analysis, we find that Japan's seemingly logical chain of arguments that high rice prices lead to inflation, which prevents the central bank from buying bonds, thereby raising Japanese bond yields, fundamentally doesn't hold water. In plain terms, these are all excuses. Japan is doing this on purpose. The consequences of Japan's actions are quite severe. In May alone, Japanese investors offloaded $50 billion in US Treasury bonds in a single week, directly causing US Treasury yields to surge. Keep in mind that Japan is the largest overseas holder of US Treasury bonds, holding approximately $1.1 trillion. If Japan continues to sell off its holdings, the US bond market could truly be in dire straits. Adding insult to injury doesn't even begin to describe it. At this point, you're probably wondering, where does Japan get such courage? US forces are still stationed there, and the Tokyo District Public Prosecutor's Office hasn't been disbanded. How dare they pull such a trick now? Is Ishiba not afraid for his life? Actually, this isn't just Ishiba's idea. While Ishiba himself isn't particularly pro-American, such a rebellious act of an obedient son challenging his father is not something he would dare to do alone, nor could he accomplish it on his own. Behind him is the collective will of Japan's entire domestic political and business establishment. So why does Japan dare to challenge the US so boldly when it hasn't even broken free from American control? There's a deeper reason for this. Let me break it down for you layer by layer. First, China taking the lead and bearing the brunt has emboldened Japan and other nations. When Trump launched the tariff war, the whole world was shocked, but everyone feared America's might and no one dared to be the first to object. That's when China stepped up, not only directly saying no to the US, but also engaging in counterattacks. This set a good example for the world. Most importantly, China's counterattacks actually had an effect, successfully forcing Trump back to the negotiating table and even prompting a 90-day delay in tariff measures against other countries. This greatly boosted everyone's morale. Then look at Vietnam. They initially chose to surrender to the US, but what happened? Trump pushed even harder, bullying Vietnam severely. With the examples of China and Vietnam, other countries are naturally more inclined to resist. Furthermore, a particularly important outcome of this Sino-US conflict is that it exposed America's hand. Everyone clearly saw that the US has actually declined. If this conflict had happened 20 or even 10 years ago, no one would have dared to resist the US. Even if China took the lead, others wouldn't have dared to follow. But this time, after just 1 month of conflict, the US couldn't hold on and actively sought peace with China. This indicates that the US is not as powerful as it claims. It lacks the strength to bear the consequences of decoupling with even a single country like China. This has prompted other countries, including Japan, to start their own calculations. Since America's tolerance for a tariff war isn't as strong as everyone thought, perhaps they too can assess their own resources and see if they can stand up to the US and achieve better outcomes through resistance. Of course, no country has as strong a foundation as China to directly confront the US, but from another perspective, no country poses as great a threat to the US as China. With China having demonstrated its ability to rival the US, and even increasingly showing signs of surpassing it, Japan and these other countries, while not as capable of resisting the US on their own, can use China as leverage to bargain with the US. The message is, don't push me too hard, or I'll side with China. This is precisely what America fears most. The US is already struggling to deal with China on its own. If it pushes other countries to side with China as well, it will be even more disadvantaged in the upcoming US-China rivalry. The more the US fears and is wary of China, the higher the united front value of other major countries like Japan to the US. Japan, with its thorough understanding of both the US and China, is well aware of this. That's why Ishiba dares to be so bold. In essence, he's using China as leverage to elevate Japan's standing in the eyes of the US and push back against American overreach. This is from a national perspective. The intensifying US-China rivalry in this process has seen China's strength continuously grow, indirectly increasing the united front value of third countries to the US. The US is now overstretched and can only rely more on cajolery and enticement, rather than coercion and intimidation, to maintain its relationships with these third countries. The EU and Japan, traditional US allies, are no exception. However, there's another question here. Other countries might be understandable, but Japan is different. It's America's obedient son. The US has military bases in Japan, controls the Tokyo District Public Prosecutor's Office, and has tightly locked Japan into its economic system. For such a country, one would expect the US to be able to control it from within at any time. So why is this situation emerging? There are two main reasons for this. Firstly, Trump's tariff policies directly touched upon Japan's economic foundation, dismantling Japan's economic reliance on the US. Take the automotive industry, for example. This is Japan's last remaining economic pillar. With the booming development of China's smart electric vehicle industry, the US, which prohibits the entry of Chinese cars, has become Japan's last major consumer market for automobiles. Trump, however, even imposed such high tariffs on cars. Isn't this an attempt to cut off Japan's lifeline? In this situation, Japan, from top to bottom, from the political to the business sphere, has been pushed to the brink. They must resist Trump to the end. If they don't resist, the collapse of the national economy means even those who want to be American compradors won't be able to make money. It is precisely for this reason that Ishiba has the confidence to be so bold. Trump is not harming Japan's interests in a specific sector, but rather the core interests of the entire nation. Various sectors in Japan have effectively united. Even if the Tokyo District Public Prosecutor's Office arrests Ishiba, the next Prime Minister, in a matter of such vital national interest, would not dare to easily accept Trump's almost catastrophic bullying demands. Secondly, and more importantly, the US is currently embroiled in serious internal political strife. The Federal Reserve and the financial capital behind it are engaged in a life and death struggle with political power represented by Trump. This is crucial. If the US was still like before, with the establishment at the forefront and financial capital behind the scenes, both sides cooperating tacitly to form a community of interests, then it would be almost impossible for Japan to openly challenge the US. But the situation is different now. The Federal Reserve, the deep state, and Trump are locked in a fierce life and death struggle. This provides Japan with an opportunity. It can exploit America's internal contradictions, supporting one faction against the other. In essence, Japan can be anti-Trump, but not anti-deep state. Specifically, Japan's selling of US Treasury bonds indeed harms Trump's interests, as the cost of issuing US debt increases, and it's Trump's administration's money being spent. But for financial capital, it's a different story. The largest buyers of US Treasury bonds are no longer overseas central banks and investors, but primarily various domestic US capital, especially financial capital. While the high cost of US bond issuance drives Trump crazy, the financial capital behind Wall Street can seize the opportunity to make a hefty profit, extracting more from the US government. More importantly, the partisan struggle between the deep state and Trump is now fiercely revolving around US Treasury bonds. Financial capital hopes to use this struggle to cripple the Trump administration's finances, thereby weakening his governing foundation, lowering his public approval ratings, and ultimately subduing or even ousting this populist leader. Seen this way, the Japanese government's rebellious actions at this moment become perfectly logical. Although it harms the superficial interests of the Trump administration, it effectively provides money and a weapon to the other faction, the deep state represented by financial capital. This significantly reduces the likelihood of Japan being retaliated against by the US. After all, Trump is just the president. If he wants to deal with Japan, he can only do so through official government-to-government channels, and that channel is currently unable to move against Japan. You can't seriously expect US forces stationed in Japan to attack the Japanese Prime Minister's residence, can you? As for the Tokyo District Public Prosecutor's Office, while it is nominally a Japanese institution, it is effectively controlled by the US. But the question is, which US faction controls it, or which faction has stronger control? This is difficult to say. When the White House and the deep state could act in unison, this wasn't an issue. But in the current situation of internal strife and partisan conflict in the US, this is a major problem. Looking at the Ishiba government's willingness to challenge the US government without fear of being jailed, it suggests that Trump's control over the Tokyo District Public Prosecutor's Office might be weaker than that of the deep state factions opposing him domestically in the US. These are all the underlying reasons why Shigeru Ishiba dares to challenge Trump. Ishiba and his government have cleverly exploited the external dynamics of the US-China rivalry and the internal partisan divisions within the US. They have found a path that not only harms Trump, but also pleases financial capital. The escalating partisan conflict in the US also means that financial capital and the deep state behind them, in order to protect their own interests and attack Trump, seem to have accepted the Japanese government's deal, sacrificing American interests to deliver money and leverage to them. In this way, Japan achieves its goal of protecting its own interests without regard for American interests. This series of transactions and power plays ultimately manifests in reality as Japan, as America's obedient son, staging a dramatic son-challenging father show, even while still under American control. However, while it's satisfying to see Japan resisting the US, we shouldn't be overly optimistic about Japan's rebellion. After all, the fundamental dynamic of Japan being America's obedient son hasn't changed. Therefore, this son-challenging father act is limited. Japan doesn't truly have the ability to rebel against the US at this stage, and the extent to which American financial capital and the deep state are willing to sacrifice national interests for their own gain and to attack Trump also has its limits. They won't genuinely smash the American rice bowl that everyone eats from just for Japan. So, once the US and Japan have contended to a certain extent, they will ultimately reach a compromise and establish a new balance. The terms of this new balanced compromise will certainly be much lower than Trump's initial exorbitant demands, but it's absolutely impossible for Japan to emerge completely unscathed. The determination of this final extent will depend on Ishiba's political maneuvering skills and the evolving dynamics of the US-China rivalry and internal US partisan conflicts. Finally, we'll just have to grab our popcorn and watch this lively drama unfold to see what kind of results these combined factors will produce. Who knows, there might even be some surprises.